This is a rust removal test with a vibratory tumbler. I found this rusty bracket. It's from a car. It held accessory underneath a car. It was mounted this way up, so while both sides look equally rusty, this side was maybe slightly protected. That's why it has that very familiar phenomenon of peeling paint. The paint, there's a little bit of original paint that's remaining, and underneath it there is a layer of rust. On the other side it's just really rusty, pitted. There is missing material. I'm not planning to reuse this. I'm going to make a replacement bracket out of stainless steel, but I thought this would be a good test specimen for rust removal with the vibratory tumbler. This green plastic media is sold as a gentle abrasive for rust removal. And by putting this bracket in the machine alone, there will not be other steel parts in it to interact with it, so all of the abrasive action on it will be by the green media and not by other parts which are tumbling in there. So let's give this a try. I'll put the media in the tumbler. It's in this colander, which I bought in a second-hand store. It's a nice stainless one. I use it to wash the media between uses. The holes here are such that even my small porcelain media doesn't fall in. Here is the tumbler action without the part added and dry. Industrial users who tumble parts that they deburr, finish, and polish in tumblers always use water and various solutions. I'll be talking about it later. They also use rust inhibitors and even rust treatments when tumbling steel parts. I will not be doing it because we're purely interested in rust removal by the mechanical action, abrasive action of this green media. So let's add water, a couple of drops of soap for lubrication of the process, and let it tumble for a number of hours. My initial plan is to tumble this bracket for 4 hours. Of course, I will not be making a 4-hour video of a running tumbler, but I will bring you back when I'm ready to check it in about 4 hours. This is 6 fluid ounces of water, and it's always amazing how it makes the process quieter. Just a few drops of soap. Maybe one more for good measure. Before we let it tumble for 4 hours, let's put on the lid. It appears that the biggest purpose of the lid is to make the process quieter. All right, we'll come back to this in a couple of hours. All right, so this is me tumbling my rusty steel bracket with green pyramids, the green plastic vibratory tumbler media. I was intending to go for 4 hours, but actually it's been almost 8. I got carried away with another project, and then I was called to dinner. Dinner was really good. But now I'm back here in the shop before bedtime to see what's happened to the bracket. Oh, I can see it right here. This may be a little bit too much foam, probably not too much, but excessive foam can cushion the media from the work. I can see it's rusty looking still, but gotta get a paper towel to wipe it off. All right, so I'm back here with a paper towel. Wiping it off. So obviously it's still rusty. If I rub it like this, hopefully you can see the red rust with this camera. Can't bring it any closer, the camera can't focus. But certainly there isn't much shiny bare metal. It's trying to get to bare metal here on the outer corners. The interesting part is that after nearly 8 hours of tumbling, it cleaned up. So now we can see the difference between rusty steel in this area and old paint. So here's the paint. I'm peeling the paint off with this dental pick. Under the paint, there is scaly rust. So 8 hours of vibratory tumbling with green media, with green plastic media, does not remove loose old paint. And it certainly doesn't make for shiny metal prep. The part is cleaner. It's the dirt has been removed. We can see where the paint is still remaining, where there is loose paint. But it's certainly not in the condition of the metal that's ready for some sort of restoration. So this is not ready to paint. This is not ready to zinc plate. It could go into the bead blasting cabinet, but it could have gone there before it got tumbled. So the conclusion is that vibratory tumbling with green plastic media, and that's a very important point, that this is probably the least, well, no, it's not the least aggressive media available. The least aggressive media, which is used for cleaning, is corn cob and to some degree walnut shell, although walnut shell is somewhat abrasive. But this green vibratory media is not a restoration grade rust remover to be used in vibratory tumblers to get to shiny metal, which could then be primed or which could then be zinc plated. It's, I think at best, tumbling with green plastic media is a process similar to rubbing with steel wool. It's somewhere on the continuum between cleaning and maybe very light flash thin layer rust removal. But your part is going to come out looking like this, with kind of burnished rust, with some blackness, and it's not clear if this is steel under the rust. And so even tumbling for days with this green media is unsatisfactory. That applies, and this video is about tumbling rusty mild steel. As I will be talking about later in the video, this green plastic media was designed and is intended for finishing aluminum, where it's a much more effective product, and where tumbling with it is a much more effective process. So how did I end up here? As you may have guessed, this was not the first time I tumbled something with this green product. We live in a consumer economy, and I take my duty to shop seriously. So when I saw this picture of a shiny bolt, which presumably was made this shiny by this green tumbling media, I immediately had to buy media and the tumbler to use it in. Because I need bolts to be in this condition for zinc plating. By the way, zinc plating hardware at home is fun and rewarding, and very doable for a do-it-yourself enthusiast. But good plating results require meticulous preparation. So this picture was just too seductive, and the next thing I knew, I had a tumbler. These are the results of an overnight tumbling of some rusty hardware. Some of it is from a car, and others is from lawn and garden equipment. The one in the car was quite rusty and scaly, and what the tumbler did, it was polish the rust and polish the unrusty parts of the hardware. And so this is more than 12 hours with green pyramid media. Interestingly, the media got dirty, as if some of the rust was transferred onto the media, and it lost its vibrant emerald color. And so the challenge of restoring hardware remains. Of course, one always has the opportunity to buy new hardware, and I should correct myself, always is probably not correct, because antique equipment hardware can be hard to find. Nothing on this tray is antique, but I do have the capability of making hardware look like this. This is a bolt that I zinc plated earlier this week. You can see the pitting on the head. I did this on purpose to be able to show you that this is a 10-year-old bolt that's been underneath a car in New England in a salt spray environment. So it was quite rusty. It was bead blasted, media blasted in a sandblasting cabinet, and then wire brushed, made real shiny, almost as shiny as the bolt in the Eastwood marketing photo, and then zinc plated. And zinc plating at home is fun and easy. So the green media can clean stuff as if you maybe brushed it with a plastic brush and wiped it off with a rag, but it certainly cannot bring rusty hardware like this to the condition where it would be suitable for zinc plating. So I bought this beautiful made in the USA machine, but my nuts are still rusty. So before I tell you about how I try to shake them next, I would like to talk a little bit about green plastic media. This is a very useful guide to vibratory media that's on the Birking website, which looks like a company of real experts about this. And it turns out that the green plastic media is used for deburring parts made out of aluminum, usually 6061 aluminum, and not for rust removal, of course. Industrial users don't have to remove rust from old hardware. So I recently had to make some brackets for another project, and I've already tumbled them in green plastic media. So if you subscribe, you'll see that video soon, and the results are spectacular because that's what green plastic media is actually for. So I was considering going back to the media blaster and put the hardware in the basket and start sandblasting every surface of every bolt, because simply pointing the abrasive at the hardware inside the basket doesn't clean all sides of the bolts. But before I did that, I decided to look for a more aggressively cutting media for the Vibratory Tumbler that could remove the rust and clean my steel, but that wouldn't be so abrasive that it would cut away the threads and make the hardware unusable. And so I found this interesting product, and the problem with trying different vibratory media is that it's sold in 50-pound bags, so small hobby user doesn't need a 50-pound bag. So you have to find vendors who are willing to sell you small quantities. And one of the expensive but interesting products that I found was this mixture of triangles, cylinders, and spheres. This is ceramic fast cutting material. If these were larger chunks, often they're star-shaped with aggressive angles on them, this would be used by industrial users to deburr steel parts and round over edges and remove various slag and dross left by various cutting processes. But these are so tiny, I thought of them to be similar to something like 400 grit or 600 grit sandpaper, where while the abrasive is aggressive and fast cutting, the finer grit and in this case the shapes, the spheres and cylinders, would not cut away the threads from the hardware. So I decided to give this stuff a try. So what does this process look like? Let's take a closer look. So here it's being tumbled dry. You can see the media moving through the machine. So normally water soap and other additives are used. Here I have about 8 fluid ounces of water, to which I'm going to add about 2 ounces of this industrial degreaser. And so let's see what it looks like inside the tumbler when this liquid is added. King's Vibratory Tumbling Guide also talks about liquid additives, and it mentions this product called Rust X300. And as I read the description, I suddenly thought that I might have something like this. Going to stop the machine to put on the lid. Going to start it again and see you in a couple of hours. Well, it's been a couple of hours, so let's see what's happened in there. To be exact, it's been 3.5 hours of tumbling. So we'll turn off the tumbler and see what we got. It is only moderately foamy. All right. So it's very smooth and clean along this shaft. And there's remaining rust on some of its faces, like in this corner. And there is rust in this recess, and I found these bolts with recessed top of the head to be the most challenging in this area. Sometimes bead blasting, media blasting is the only way to get in there and clean that out. So with this flange nut, the space, the corner between the flange and the wrench surfaces of the nut remains rusty, so the porcelain media cannot get in there to scrape it. And this is sort of proof that even though I put a couple of ounces of evaporast in here, most of this is done by abrasive action of the media, because areas where you wouldn't expect the media to get in well are the ones where rust remains. This nut is pristine, but it wasn't that rusty to begin with. Let's look at some of the other stuff in here. Here is I believe it's a brake caliper bolt. Same thing, This area looks beautiful. There's a little brown in between the threads. This recess has rust, and the top of the head of the bolt has rust here. And of course, the exposed bolt head just gets rustier because it's not protected from the environment. So that's probably part of the reason the bolt heads are one of the harder areas to prep. This is a cam bolt from the top of the strut. It looks beautiful almost all around, except in the threads where it always needs some wire brushing. But again, this recessed head is always challenging, and it's hard to get a wire brush in there as well. So these are the results after a couple of hours of vibrating in this soapy evaporast wet soup with very small porcelain vibratory media. I didn't mention it earlier, but I believe that this smaller media, even though the material it's made from is typically used for aggressive cutting, because of the small size of these particles, and because some of them are spheres, the cutting action ends up being not very aggressive. This is probably akin to using fine grit sandpaper, like a 600 grit sandpaper, even though aluminum oxide on that sandpaper may be an aggressive abrasive. The fine grit leads to low material removal. The same is happening here. The fine size of the media leads to low material removal, which is what we want here. We want to take off the old zinc plating and rust, and not much else, certainly not steel off of the threads. But in real life, this process does not all by itself produce a ready-to-plate bolt, so some additional manual work is necessary. For me, if I'm doing a dozen or two bolts on a small project, then I have to take less than a minute on a wire brush to clean up these threads. If I'm doing a dozen bolts and I have to wire brush each of them for a minute, that's 12 minutes. That's manageable. But all of this is time consuming. But plating is not worth it if the prep is poor. So if you're contemplating plating, like I do, you have to do the prep. I wash the media and store it dry, and store the machine dry and clean. There was a couple of areas that needed additional work, and they're being bead blasted here with 40 grit aluminum oxide in a media blasting cabinet. It didn't take long, and it certainly took less time than it would have if this was the first operation. And of course we have to go to the wire brush. This is a brass brush. Earlier I talked about how it wouldn't be a big deal if this took 1 minute per bolt. It probably takes more like 2 to 3 minutes per bolt. But the results are quite good, and in the end it's in the condition in which it's ready for zinc plating. You may be wondering, why is he doing this and why didn't he go to the beach instead? And that's because I have a compulsion to zinc plate hardware. So if you want to see me do it, hit subscribe. It's more interesting and more educational than watching people unbox packages and eat laundry detergent.